Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
A very warm welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast that goes beyond the myths, the movies and the legends of RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jane Gulliford Lowes and it's lovely to have you with us again. Today I'm flying solo once again as James is sitting out the first few episodes of this series, so no co-pilot with me in the studio, but I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a very special guest. Many of you will be familiar with his work. He's one of Britain's leading authorities on the RAF and the Second World War. To date, he's published more than 40 books, including 15 about aspects of Bomber Command's history alone. Among these are the very popular Haynes aircraft manuals on Bomber Command, and my personal favourite, of course, the Handley Page Halifax manual. Both are volumes that I reach for regularly. In fact, Jonathan's books were among the first I read when I very first began researching the bombing war, so it's an absolute pleasure to welcome to the podcast Jonathan Falconer. Jonathan, hello and welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters. How are you and what have you been working on recently?
Jane, thanks for inviting me as well to join you on Never Mind the Dambusters. Well, among other projects I've been working on is a new edition of one of my short Stirling books, Stirling Wings. It was first published back in 1995 and it's hard to believe that 30-odd years ago now. But of course,
that's perfect timing then for this episode, isn't it? Absolutely perfect timing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's, Stirling is sort of omnipresent in my life anyway.
That's good because it gets so little publicity, doesn't it? So can you tell me a little bit about your background, Jonathan, and how you became interested in Bomber Command? Because I think you've got sort of RAF royalty in your family just about, haven't you?
Well, about royalty, but both my dad and my maternal grandfather served in the Royal Air Force. My dad was a regular in the 1950s in the signals branch. My grandfather was a Halton apprentice, a fourth entry at Halton in 1923. He trained as a fitter 2E, aero engines, and went on to great things as an Irk, I suppose you'd say, on the RAF high-speed flight at Calshot and Felixstowe and with the Schneider Trophy teams in 1927, 29, 31. And from there, he was posted overseas to Iraq and then from there to the Northwest Frontier Province in India, then back to Britain at the beginning of the war when he got heavily involved in the birth of the photo reconnaissance activities for the RAF, first at Heston and then at Spenson in Oxfordshire. So he was commissioned then from the ranks and further postings to India, Egypt, Singapore, and then back to RAF Cullen in Wiltshire, where he finished his career as the wing commander commanding the engineering wing there. So not bad for a boy entrant without wings. So yeah,
absolutely not.
So that's where my fascination comes from. It was always the conversation around the table at lunchtime or dinner time and what grandfather had been doing, what Uncle so-and-so had done. In fact, I have a great uncle as well who was with the Royal Naval Air Service during the First World War, who went into the RAF. He was another engineer. He was, I've got his commission document here as well from the 1st of April 1918, and he was commissioned as a major into at that time he was a major in the Air Force, Royal Air Force at that time, but I think that's when they started changing the ranks around to the ones we know today. So yeah, it's in the blood.
Sounds like it. Wow, what an exciting career, an interesting career your maternal grandfather must have had, though, and the changes that he must have seen in terms of sort of technology and tactics, etc., in the time that he served. It's just mind-blowing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I mean, it spanned the stick and string period right up to the jet and guided missile age. So that was, I think he was probably happy to move on then, but he finally ended up at BAC at Filton in Bristol on the Bloodhound guided missile program. So,
gosh, that's quite the career, isn't it? Yeah. Absolutely
The
fantastic.
funny thing was he would never, ever go away abroad on holiday.
Yeah, exactly. Might have had a bit
I
enough
think he
of
was sick to death of hot countries.
being abroad.
Yeah.
Can understand that. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about one of the most distinctive and perhaps one of the most underappreciated aircraft of the Second World War, the short Stirling. It was Bomber Command's first four-engine heavy bomber, yet it tends to be overshadowed in the public imagination by its more famous successors, the Halifax and, of course, the Lancaster. But before we get into its operational history, Jonathan, I'd like to begin with the origins of the Stirling itself. So the Stirling was born out of a pre-war Air Ministry specification that evolved significantly over time. Can you sort of walk us through the development of the aircraft, Jonathan? What the RAF was looking for, how Short Brothers responded, and why the Stirling ended up with some bits more, shall we say, unusual design features?
Well, Stirling, as you say, was born out of a pre-war Air Ministry specification B1236, to be precise, that was issued in 1936. And this was at the time when Britain was frantically gearing up for war. The specification called for a high-performance heavy bomber that was capable of carrying a large bomb load over long range and able to fight its corner with a strong defensive armament. The spec also stated that the aircraft should be usable as a troop transport for 24 soldiers if required. Now, as we know, this decision or this requirement would prove prescient when we consider what happened to the Stirling later in its career.
Yeah.
But B1236 specifically required a maximum bomb load of 14,000 pounds carried over 2,000 miles or 8,000 pounds over 3,000 miles, and it specified a cruising speed of at least 230 miles per hour at 15,000 feet and 3 gun turrets for defence. But to satisfy these criteria, the specification conceded that the aircraft would be large, obviously.
Yeah.
In the words of the design spec, quote, it should not exceed a span of 100 feet, which dispels the myth that the Stirling's narrow wingspan was needed to fit inside the standard RAF hangar of the day, which was the big C-type, which had a width of about 150 feet. So at a shade over 99 feet, that's a bit of a nonsense to suggest that the Stirling was designed to fit in the standard hangar. But it's one of these sort of urban myths that's sort of grown and grown over the years. There were 11 designs submitted to satisfy the specification from 5 manufacturers, and the Air Ministry shortlisted 2, and Shorts won the tender.
Now, the Stirling had a reputation for being both impressive and frustrating. Powerful, yes, sturdy, but hampered by a rather infamous ceiling restriction. So what were the aircraft's early performance characteristics, and how did the sort of strengths and limitations shape its role in the coming bomber offensive?
Well, going back to what you said a little bit earlier about it being powerful, sturdy, and then hampered, it really was a powerful aircraft by virtue of its sheer size when compared to other bombers of the day. And when you view it in comparison to its contemporaries, later contemporaries, the Halifax and the Lancaster, it really was a Leviathan, a real beast. It was frustrating because in its early incarnation, the Mark I, with the Bristol Hercules 2 engines, they were woefully underpowered. And of course, the great Stirling Achilles heel, I suppose you'd call it, was its flimsy undercarriage. Now, excessively long takeoff and landing runs were highlighted by the half-size prototype that Shorts used to test the design before committing to a full-size version. And when it was tested at Martlesham Heath, they recommended increasing the wing incidence by 3 degrees to make a total of 6.5 degrees. Now, that would increase the lift and considerably reduce the takeoff run. But the penalty was a massive increase in drag. And this is something they found when they were testing, that the takeoff and landing runs were just too long. The problem here was that Shorts had jumped the gun a little bit by having received an order for 100 Stirlings from the government. They put the production planning into full, into gear, and it was moving forward with at an advanced stage, and factory tooling had already started, which made any fundamental design change impossible and basically unfeasible from a money point of view.
Yeah, very expensive.
So the only option was to add 3 degrees. Yeah. I mean, that's what they did. They lengthened the already long, gangly undercarriage legs to retract in 2 stages. So it retracted into a kind of a crate-like structure, which introduced a design weakness in so doing that would eventually hobble the design. So, and add that in with the officially imposed shortened wingspan and a very narrow bomb bay that was divided into 3 longitudinal sections which defied modification. You had the how do I say it? The seeds for the Stirling's problems.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the armaments on board? How it was sort of envisaged that this absolute beast was going to defend itself?
Well, the Stirling benefited from a lot of the development that had been done during the 30s on power-operated turrets, like Parnell's and Bolton Paul. And in common with the other heavies that came along, it had power-operated Fraser-Nash turrets in the nose, mid-upper position and tail. Some of the early Mark 1s had beam gun, handheld beam gun positions, but those were pretty short-lived. And I believe there was a ventral turret as well that was done away with pretty soon as well. So that was its kind of defensive armament, which by the standards of the day was heavy.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, the RAF anyway. I'm just thinking about that sort of blueprint diagram that everybody who listens to this show will have seen, which is sort of the Halifax, the Lancaster, the Wellington, I think the Blenheim, all sort of superimposed on skeleton of the Stirling, and you can see how much bigger it is even than those. So I remember sort of seeing Lancaster and the Halifax mock-up that they've got at the Yorkshire Air Museum, and they to me just seem absolutely bloody enormous. But the Stirling is so much bigger even still, isn't it? It's just, you can't even get your head around it.
It is. It's a big airplane, and a lot of it came from Short's experience before the war building flying boats. That's why a lot of the technology and design templates, I suppose, particularly like the wings, for instance, were borrowed from the C-class Empire boats that Short's built for Imperial Airways. But the actual height of the aircraft, I remember talking to one ex-Stirling pilot. He said, if you want to get a good idea of what it's like to sit in the cockpit of a Stirling, he said, go up to the top floor of a London double-decker bus, he said, and sit up the front. And then he said, you'll get some feel for what it was actually like. And he said, that's what it was. That's what it was like for us. A lot higher than things like the Wellington or the Hampden or the Whitleys, the earlier ones.
Yeah, gosh.
So, yes, and it was also a very long walk from the, if you went in through the crew access door at the rear fuselage, it was a long walk up to the front. So,
yeah, very long way indeed. So let's talk about the Stirling on operations then. So how was the aircraft employed during the main phase of the bombing campaign? And how did its use evolve from an operational point of view? How did crews adapt to flying a machine with such sort of distinctive handling and performance traits? I think we kind of need to go back as well to when it was actually first introduced to the squadrons as well. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Stirling was introduced to the squadrons with 7th Squadron at Leeming in August 1940, and it really didn't get, because of the problems it had inherited from the design shortcomings, it was very quickly relegated to a training aircraft until they could iron out all these snags. And it wasn't until the 10th of February 1941 that the very first bombing raid by Stirling's was carried out. And this was under great pressure from Winston Churchill to actually use these big sticks to beat the Germans with. And this was against an oil storage facility in Rotterdam. And then, obviously, with the RAF's early war obsession with daylight operations for bombers and the fact that the bomber would always get through, and bristling armament of an aircraft like the Stirling would see off the German fighter defences. In practice, as we know, it just didn't work and it was a disaster. So early use of Stirlings on daylight circus sorties this would have been in July 1941, proved that it was suicidal. which meant that the Stirling was very, very soon thereafter committed to the night offensive.
And even though its shortcomings were obvious at a very early stage, how did that sort of impact production? Because they must have still just kept producing them regardless, because they're still flying at the end of the war, aren't they?
Yeah, they kept flying. They kept building them, but obviously in much smaller quantities than the Lancaster or the Halifax.
Mm-hmm.
The Stirling was. I mean, it was looked upon as being sort of hand built, as opposed to sort of mass produced like some of the other aircraft types that the RAF used. And this goes back again to Short's experience as a flying boat builder before the war, where a lot of stuff was literally hand built. Although that said, mass production techniques were used, particularly at factories like the Austin factory at Longbridge, where they had production line of Stirlings. Same at Swindon with the South Marston in Swindon, where they had dispersed production as well.
And I'm just sort of thinking about the earlier operations, how did the casualty rates compare with other aircraft types, other bomber types around about the time? Were they more or less about the same, or were these higher? Or
the Halifax is, if you looked at it at sort of a number of aircraft involved and the crew losses as a sort of percentage, the Stirling really did rack up a fairly alarming rate of attrition. But I'll come to that a bit later on. But its involvement in the night offensive against Germany really kind of took off in sort of mid 41 onwards, and it flew some of the first long-range sorties to Italy in September 41, and that was 7 and 15 squadrons. They were the two, the birth squadrons, if you like, of the Stirling force in the RAF. So they sent aircraft to bomb Turin.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Wellingtons and Whitleys had bombed Italy earlier on, but this was the first long-range sortie carried out by the Stirling to targets in Italy. But as we know, 1942 was the big year when Bomber Harris took over in February 1942. And to sort of prove the worth of Bomber Command against its detractors, he gambled the whole strength of Bomber Command on the famous 1,000 bomber raid against Cologne in end of May 1942. And 5 Stirling squadrons and 1 whole Stirling heavy conversion unit took part in that operation. So that was 88 Stirlings took part, 2 failed to return, which is not a bad
return rate, no. Yeah.
It's an acceptable rate of attrition. And they were again involved a couple of nights later when Essen was raided, and that wasn't quite as big a success as Cologne, but these raids, 1,000 bomber raids, were a turning point in Bomber Command success.
Yeah.
And then Pathfinders, August 42, 7 Squadron became one of the 5 founder squadrons. Now, I had quite a long chat years ago with Hamish Mahadi, who I was very fortunate to have known pretty well. And he described to me the whole business of Don Bennett ordering the removal of heavy armour plating and just about anything that was considered superfluous or redundant to the aircraft's effective operation. So they got rid of any ammunition that wasn't deemed used. So they sort of worked out how many rounds on average were loosed off on a typical operation and took out whatever was not used in the sense of what they would load in again. Fuel reserve was reduced, and Hamish said that, we could get Stirlings up to above 18,000 feet, he said, on the Pathfinder force. And he said it was all about getting rid of extra weight. And he said far too much heavy armour plating in that aircraft. And I mean, he spoke as a former Stirling pilot as well, so he knew what he was on about.
Yeah. So what was its usual ceiling then? Is about 15,000, something like that?
Well, it's a kind of a bit of a flexible
movable feast, isn't it, really? Yeah.
Movable feast, that's the one. And the Stirling's always been kind of pretty much a kind of give a dog a bad name, in as much as it couldn't reach a decent operating height and it was unreliable, etc. But it seemed, having spoken to some of the blokes who actually flew the planes, it seemed to vary from one aircraft to another. Some were better than others, and I suppose that could be said for a lot of other aircraft as well.
Yeah.
Not to mention cars.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that. Yeah.
Now, some of the later, yeah, some of the old British Leyland cars, for instance. Some of the later series Mark 1s and the Mark 3s could actually reach 18,000 feet fully loaded on approach to a target, while others would struggle to make 13,000, maybe 15,000 feet if they were lucky.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big range there. And
it is, yeah.
Another ex-Stirling man told me, he said it was basically, he believed it was down to the experience of the pilot. And, they were capable of reaching 18,000 feet, but he said most pilots were inexperienced, and they come through the training, RAF Bomber Command training system, and the conversion units, he said, didn't have the time or resources to fine-tune the skills of every pilot that passed through their hands. So, they came through with the bare, because of the pressures of the times, what the bare skills they needed to actually fly aircraft operationally. And unfortunately, that experience only came with hands on the job when they were actually on a frontline squadron.
Yeah, that reminds me of my uncle's crew's experience. When they were on the heavy conversion unit, they were going to fly Halifaxes with 10 Squadron, and I think they had 13 hours experience of night flying on the Halifax before they went to join the operational squadron. 13 hours. It's just like, it's nothing, is it? It's just insane. Yeah.
Woeful, isn't it?
But this is early 43. Yeah. So obviously when the turnover of crews and stuff is really, really increasing. So let's just move on to...
It all started.
Yeah. It all started to go a bit pear-shaped, didn't it? Yeah. Let's have a think about some notable missions and combat experience then. So the Stirling might have been overshadowed later, but it was heavily engaged during some of Bomber Command's toughest periods, as we've just been mentioning, particularly at 43. Are there any sort of particular operations that stand out to you, either for their historical significance or for what they reveal about the bravery and resilience of Stirling crews? Obviously, you've just mentioned the 1,000 bomber raids there in 42. What about sort of getting into 43 and 44?
Yeah, well, 43, I think, is the watershed period for the Stirling, in as much as it took part in three of the big night offensives of that year. The Ruhr, Battle of the Ruhr, which raged from March to July. Then you've got the Hamburg fire raids, end of July to beginning of August, and then the beginning of the Battle of Berlin, which, although I suppose technically that didn't start until later in the year, the first big ops against Berlin were flown from August 1943, and they went right through to March 44 when although it wasn't Berlin, the Nuremberg raid of the end of March 44 kind of was the backstop for that period of operations, with all the horrendous losses that came out of that. The Stirling did suffer pretty badly during this period, and problems with serviceability on the squadrons. On a daily basis, they couldn't be relied upon to muster a full, maximum effort from some squadrons. And this wasn't so much to do with crews, it's to do with the actual mechanical reliability and serviceability of the aircraft. And when measured against the Halifaxes and the Lancaster squadrons, it very much threw the Stirling's continued viability into doubt. And that came to a head in November, 22nd of November, when Bomber Harris said, no more. We're not throwing Halifax squadrons against targets over Germany any longer. That's it. So they were then used to a lot of the gardening sorties, which, I mean, that started in 1942. As you'll know, Jane, that's your...
40.
Your thing.
Pro 40, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Stirling, I think the first Stirling mine lane sortie was in March 42, and that was 42. Just 3 aircraft from 15 Squadron carried that out.
Yeah.
Off Brittany. So They were very much relegated then, and this is when the whole fortunes of the Stirling changed, probably for the better, arguably, when it kind of changed role completely.
Yeah. So, this is one thing I want to touch on. So the Stirling begins to move away from the main bombing offensive, doesn't it? And it moved towards roles such as transport, glider towing as well, I think, and some special duties roles, as well as gardening, as you've just mentioned. I know that Stirlings did do a fair bit of gardening. So what prompted this transition then? And how successful was the aircraft in these later roles? Was it just the fact that it was clearly struggling doing heavy bombing because there were so many of them? They had to be used for something else. It's about using the resources that you've got available to you for, whatever roles are required.
To a degree, I mean, Shorts had already gone about producing an airborne forces version of the Stirling, which manifested itself in the Stirling Mark IV, which had quite a few design changes that were obviously visual changes to it, compared to the bomber, where there was no mid-upper turret. The nose turret was removed and replaced with a transparent perspex sort of nose cap. And there were cargo doors fitted in the bottom of the aircraft to drop supplies from, and also as a paratroop hatch. But that was, I believe, was the kind of almost the salvation for the Stirling, because it had been saved from what was a bad slight on its character towards the end of 1943, and it really did redeem itself as a special duties squadron aircraft, flying operations for the Special Operations Executive over occupied Europe, Scandinavia, Norway.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was probably king of those operations, if I'm truthful. Well, Halifax flew them as well, but the Stirling was particularly well suited to low-level operations because of its, ironically, I suppose, because of its short wingspan. It had a very high aspect ratio wing, which made it good at turning, good at rolling, good at that kind of regime at low level.
Which is the exact opposite of what you'd expect for an aircraft of that sort of size and bulk, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, once again, some of the old Stirling boys have told me that, it's brilliant at low level. I mean, it's still a big airplane and you couldn't expect it to do silly things, but for what it was doing and for something it hadn't actually been designed for on purpose, it actually excelled. Plus the fact that it was built inside like a barn, so you could get a lot of paratroops in there. You could get a huge amount of supplies for dropping in the back of the aircraft, and it was a strong airplane with the ability to tow gliders, Horsa gliders.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to ask you about that.
Filled with troops.
Yeah, was it involved in Arnhem or was it just sort of later ops like Varsity and that sort of thing?
No, Stirling actually was used first of all on airborne operations on the eve of D-Day.
Oh, of course.
And they flew Pathfinder paratroopers into the Orne Bridgehead in Normandy to actually mark out the landing zones rather, for the horses that were about to follow to take Pegasus Bridge.
Gosh,
and then they were involved in
the
resupply of troops and equipment later on in D-Day. So they were right at the cutting edge of the invasion.
Yeah.
And as you say, Arnhem, they were at the forefront of Arnhem alongside the Dakota squadrons. And later, in 1945, as you say also, Operation Varsity, where they towed gliders from bases in eastern England across to the Rhine and supported the Rhine crossing.
So an aircraft which, despite its apparent limitations, actually proved itself to be extremely versatile and very useful.
It did. I mean, and it had other cards up its sleeve. The 199 Squadron was the sort of, I suppose you'd call it, the one of the forerunners of the radio countermeasures, electronic warfare.
All right, yeah.
They were fitted Mandrel electronic jamming equipment. They were used for windowing operations to deceive enemy radar operators with fake bomber streams. In fact, some of the Stirlings of 199 Squadron racked up some of the highest operational sortie rates of any squadron in Bomber Command.
Wow.
Maybe because they weren't actually over the target as such, because they were sort of standing off, if you like, using their electronic gadgetry to fox the Germans. But that said, there are not many Stirlings that got anything more than sort of 30 or 40 ops, but you've got some from 199 Squadron that were well up into the sort of late below 100 operations, which is remarkable.
That's extreme, isn't it? Yeah.
Nobody ever thinks. Yeah.
That's really, really impressive. Now, I'd just like to kind of look at the human story for a moment, if we can. What life was like day to day for aircrew serving on the Stirling squadrons. Did their experiences differ much from, say, those flying Lancasters or Halifaxes? What was a Stirling crewman's day-to-day life like?
I don't think this is from what I've gleaned from the men who did the flying. It wasn't appreciably different from those flying Lancasters or Halifaxes, except for an ex-Halifax gunner I used to speak to about things like this, and he said, we used to joke that we didn't want to hit any Stirlings when we were releasing our bomb load, so we had to keep a good lookout. He said, they're always far too far below us. So I think there was a bit of stick that went on there. But the actual general experience, the day-to-day life of a bomber crewman was fairly similar across the forces, whether they were Lancaster, Halifax or Stirling. That's in Bomber Command, that is.
Yeah.
And I think for the Stirling crew, they actually had a slightly better deal than the crews in the other two big four engine aircraft, in as much as it was a very roomy aeroplane inside, and a lot of the blokes said it might have been a bit cold, but it was comfortable because it was roomy. You weren't crammed in.
Not on top of each other. Yeah.
And also they took some solace. Yeah. They took some solace in the knowledge that it was actually easier to bail out of than the Lancaster. And it sort of shared that with the Halifax, which was another aircraft that had a better survival rate, should we say, than the Lancaster, which, not a lot of people know that, as Michael Caine would probably say. But
yeah. Can I just mention your book about the day-to-day? Is it Bomber Command Crewman, it's called? A little slim publication of yours that I read ages and ages ago. Bought it. Where did I buy that? Oh, I bought it at the RAF Museum, I think, years ago. And I read that, and it was just absolutely revelational to me. But I was beginning my research journey into my uncle's crew, and it was so informative. And for anyone who's just sort of kind of getting into Bomber Command or wants to know more about what daily life was like for a crewman, I highly recommend Jonathan's book on that. It is absolutely brilliant. It's only sort of slim. It's only a tiny little thing, but there's so much detail in it. It's just basically like 24 hours in the life of a crewman. It is fantastic. How did you come to write that book, Jonathan?
Thank you, Jane. I originally wrote it for the company I was working for at the time. This was in the sort of the late noughties, I suppose you would call it. They were producing a series of kind of what they called, I think, eyewitness guides to things like what it was like to be a midshipman on a first-rate ship of the line at Trafalgar in 1805, or what was it like to be riding a charger in the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. So it's kind of, what was a day in the life like for a soldier then, or a sailor, or somebody, a soldier at Agincourt or Bannockburn or someone like that. And they asked me if I could write one on the crewman, which I did. And for whatever reason, they decided to can the whole series after a while. And my book wasn't published because it was one of the later ones. So I handed it over to another publisher, which was Shire Publications, which a lot of people will know have got a brilliant list, very eclectic. And I had to make a few adjustments to it, but it turned into RAF Bomber Crewman, which is really a primer. It's not meant to be kind of detailed primary research on the whole subject, but it gives you insights into, what was the bomber offensive, who were the bomber boys, what's life like on a bomber airfield, and what was a day in the life like, and what kit did they wear, and what happened when they got demobbed, things like that. It's
no, it's great. It's as I say, for anyone who's just sort of getting into the subject, it is absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it. Those other ones sound really interesting as well, though. It's a shame that the series didn't get continued, because all of those sound really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's curious. You can never explain a decision sometimes of those higher up in organisations to do what they do.
True.
But sort of like you're saying, it's had some quite good reception and reviews. So I'm happy, and I enjoyed working on it, which is what makes it for me. I love the process of research and writing.
Yeah, well, it's a cracker. Highly recommended. And for our readers, I'll put some links in the show notes so people can have a look at that. So I'd just like to move on then to the concept of legacy and popular memory, because the Stirling doesn't always receive the recognition it deserves in the wider story of Bomber Command. Why do you think it has slipped from popular memory, Jonathan, to some extent? And how should we understand its legacy today? Both the aircraft itself and the men who flew and maintained her.
Very good question. Why has it slipped from popular memory? I suppose a lot of it is down to the glamour of the Lancaster, and in much the same way as the Spitfire. The Lancaster was the kind of the pin-up boy of the RAF's bomber offensive, in the same way as the Spitfire was the pin-up of the fighter command, and largely down to the Battle of Britain. But it was every fighter was a Spitfire, according to little boys.
Every bomber was a Lancaster.
Every bomber was a Lancaster.
Yeah, this is what I call the Lancastrification of Bomber Command history, because I've been mounting a campaign over the last 6 or 7 years to get more recognition for the Halifax and the Halifax crews. And again, you could say the same for the Stirling as well. The Lancaster is just so up there in the popular memory, but it's to do with the Dams raids, isn't it? And it's to do with the Battle of Britain Memorial fight as well, I think, and all of those things. Our view of history gets ever narrower, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the film, the Dambusters film, 1955, Appointment in London.
That's a cracker, that one.
Two films, I think, really kind of fixed the Lancaster in popular sort of iconography, if you like. That's where it all stems from, in my opinion. And there aren't any films about the Wellington apart from Target for Tonight, which was made during the early part of the war, but nobody would know now. They think of Wellington's a pair of rubber boots. It's these things pass beyond. Same with all these planes, aircraft, Whitley, Ham, and the Halifax, which is a great favourite. I think alongside the Stirling, the Halifax is my other great favourite. Having sort of family connections to that aircraft. Too, which sort of makes it special to me. But at the end of the war, if we slightly twist the answer on this, later Halifax Mark 7 could actually outperform the Lancaster.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of rate of climb and things.
Yeah, it was a much better aircraft.
It was turned into a really effective airplane, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that they allowed Bristols to actually design the whole power egg for the aircraft, rather than Handley Page, who completely messed it up with the Merlins of the early Halifaxes by insisting that they designed their own engine mounts, which caused a lot of the early Halifaxes problems.
Yeah, I spoke to a chap who'd flown the Mark II Halifax and then moved on to the Mark III with the Bristol Hercules engines, and he said it was like going from a tractor into a sports car. He said that the difference was just incredible.
Yeah.
But don't get me going about Halifaxes again, because we'll be here all night, because that's my pet subject. Yeah, it really is. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. That's been an absolutely fascinating chat. I've really enjoyed it. And it's just had the absolute right level of nerdery as well. I'm sure our listeners will absolutely love that, all the stats and, technical stuff. Yeah, they all love that kind of thing. It's been absolutely fascinating to explore the story of the short Stirling with you. I think it's an aircraft that certainly paved the way for the heavy bomber offensive, and it deserves far more attention than it often receives. And your insights have really helped bring its history and its crews back into focus.
Can I just give a quick plug to the new edition of my book, Stirling Wings, that was first published in 1995 that I mentioned earlier during our chat, Jane. It's going to be published next year by JJN Publishing Limited. At the moment, the title has not been firmed up, but it's a complete revamp of Stirling Wings. It's got a third more material in it than the first edition, new photographs, new accounts from those who were involved in the flying and maintaining the aircraft, and quite a bit on the war over Norway towards the end of the war.
My other favourite subject, yeah.
Yeah. So please look out for this next year. It's, as I say, it's being designed at the moment, but I've yet to firm up the title. But look at JJN Publishing website, and we'll release the name of the title on there as soon as we've fought over it and decided what we're going to call it.
Well, let us know when it's published, Jonathan, and we'll put the links on our website and in the show notes and stuff, so that our listeners can directly as soon as it comes out. Please do let us know.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Our pleasure. So thank you to Jonathan, and thank you to everyone listening all around the world. I think we're now listening to in something like 127 countries, which is absolutely insane. It really is mad. We'll be back very, very soon with more untold stories and new perspectives on the world of Bomber Command. If you've been enjoying the podcast, one of the best ways to support us is by leaving a quick rating or review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a moment, but it helps more people discover Never Mind the Dambusters. If you'd like to go a step further, you can also support the show from as little as £2.40 or $3 a month. There's a link in the show notes for you to subscribe. And don't forget to join the conversation in our Facebook group or connect with us on social media. Thank you so much all for listening. We'll be back next week with another intriguing discussion focusing on legendary de Havilland Mosquito. See you all then. Thank you. Bye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.